Yesterday we talked about the conflict in the mansion, but now it's time to switch gears to Emilia's unknowable present. While there weren't any extensive scenes excluded from the anime, there were a lot of subtle details you may have missed that helped to make the emotional climax that much more effective, especially when it comes to the build-up that went into leading Emilia towards the answer of the trial. So I highly recommend watching to the end so you can see exactly how everything pieces together. Let's begin. Episode 47, Part 2, Happiness Reflected Upon the Water's Surface, covering Chapter 2 of Volume 15 of the light novel. With Fortuna's gentle voice being the first thing she heard, Emilia immediately found herself to be overwhelmed by a storm of emotions. She couldn't understand exactly why she was so moved by her mother's presence, but just the sight of her eyes was enough to bewilder her to the point of speechlessness. As Fortuna continued to brush her hair, she decided to tease Emilia in return for her comment about the dress, mainly pointing out how tired she looked. You see, even after being sent to the watering hole to clean herself up, Fortuna couldn't help but notice just how drowsy she still was. It was almost as if she was still half asleep or something. So Fortuna was teasing her for being so cumbersome. Now, after Emilia's hair was finished, the anime made it seem like she wasn't able to see her reflection. But that's not exactly what had happened. While she was intent on seeing how she looked, Emilia found herself unable to commit to it. No matter what she did, she couldn't get her legs to move towards the mirror. This wasn't because she couldn't see herself, though. It was more so because she didn't want to. There was this inexplicable feeling preventing her from moving any closer. So, as she stood just out of range of the mirror's reflection, that's when Juice arrived to save her from her predicament. It was almost instantly that he too commented on Emilia's peculiar behavior. You see, he had asked Emilia to treat him kindly today, a statement that implied that something was happening. Since Emilia had no idea what it was only natural that she ask about it. But this was what went to make Juice so confused, because the one who had asked to go to the lake in the first place was none other than Emilia herself. Although she couldn't remember, Emilia did feel like this was a request that she'd made once upon a time ago. So she was happy to be able to finally follow through with it. Once they had arrived at the lake, Emilia had put on yet another display of rather odd behavior. She was almost instantly captivated by the beauty of the scenery around her, making her unable to move as she tried to bask in all its splendor. With this being the second time she had dazed off into an expression of bewilderment, Fortuna had to ask her again if she was feeling okay. It was a question that ended up being answered by the grumbling of her stomach, leading the three of them to sit down and eat like how we saw in the anime. Now, the reason for Emilia's tears was because the only thing she wanted was for Juice and Fortuna to be happy. She wanted nothing more than for both of them to be able to be happy together. So, for the two of them to be exchanging laughs like how they were doing right here, well, that was the greatest joy that Emilia could have ever hoped for. Moving on to the scene with Archie, he also made sure to comment on the odd nature of Emilia's behavior. Just like everyone else had noticed, there was something about both her voice and face that made her seem different. She seemed to be a lot more grounded in comparison to how she usually was. Since Fortuna wasn't here this time to excuse it as her sleepiness, Emilia instead teased Archie for being so mean, causing him to panic and apologize numerous times over. It was after this that she then changed the topic to that of Juice and Fortuna. When Archie made the comment of how their relationship only needed time, it was the very fact that there wasn't any that caused her to start to break down. You see, Emilia knew that it was only a matter of time before Juice and Fortuna would have ended up together. Whether it took months or years, she knew the day was sure to come when the relationship was going to blossom. So this was a sight that she wanted to see more than anything. But as much as she yearned to celebrate the happiness of this couple with the entire forest, this world she was dreaming of simply didn't exist. The day she desired the most was one that was never coming. As much as she would have loved to live the rest of her life in this perfect fantasy, the fact that she couldn't forget the fate of the two most important people to her was the very reason behind why she couldn't. This was a stance that Emilia seemed very intent on maintaining, but Archie's next words made it so much more difficult to do so. I mean, it would have been much easier for Emilia to handle them if he just reproached her for being careless and ungrateful. But the way he spoke as if out of sympathy instead of anger was what made them that much harder to stomach. Reason being that it was clear that he just wanted her to be happy. Emilia could tell that all he wanted was for her to be at peace. So for her to willingly choose a path that was sure to be filled with numerous burdens and hardships, Well, that was more than enough to cause Archie a little bit of heartache. It was a gentle feeling of compassionate sorrow that echoed through every one of his words. When Archie went on to question her choice of a future where getting hurt was a certainty, Emilia's initial response was that she didn't want to be hurt. She explained how she was going out there to search for a future where she wouldn't have to be hurt. A future where running and hiding wasn't something she'd have to do anymore. When given a response like this, it was only natural for Archie to follow up by asking about the wounds deeply engraved into her heart. Surely that future she was in search of wouldn't be able to bring back anything she'd lost already. So Archie wanted to know if she would still go out and look for it. This was the question that led her to declare how she wanted to be strong like everyone else. It was because she wanted to save others just like how she'd been saved by them that she was able to choose the world on the outside. Now, when Echidna came around at the end of the trial, Emilia instantly regretted turning around to look at her. The feelings that came when she saw this witch's face on the brink of tears were ones that she never wanted at all. So Emilia immediately wished to have never looked in the first place. As for Echidna, we don't know exactly why she decided to react the way she did. But the novel does state how her mere presence was there only to instill bitterness. So perhaps Echidna was feeling a bit envious of Emilia's ability to be content with a less than ideal world. Or maybe her inability to understand Emilia's decisions and feelings were causing a bit of inner turmoil. Whatever it was, Emilia couldn't be bothered to figure it out right now. What she needed to do was determine how she was going to end the trial. As she looked over the cliff and down to the water below, the sight of her reflection was what allowed her to understand the answer she needed to come to. She began to think about the differences and similarities between this world and the one she belonged to, eventually leading her to the conclusion that there was a single element that was both different and the same. An element she could only identify as herself. I mean, the way everyone had been pointing out how she was acting so differently made it that much more apparent. So, by realizing that she was the component that didn't belong in either world, she understood that in order to complete the trial she needed to accept herself. Only after acknowledging and understanding who she was in the world she was in would the second trial come to its end. Since that's what she needed to do, Emilia decided to force herself into a situation she'd been avoiding for the past century. You see, ever since she'd awoken from her slumber, not once had she ever looked at her reflection. She was always too scared and afraid to see what she looked like. Having awoken in a body that was completely unfamiliar to her, Emilia's immature heart just wouldn't allow her to. It was a feeling of fear that only stacked every time the villagers turned themselves away from her. And though she didn't know before, she eventually came to understand that her features bore similarity to the Witch of Envy. So it was the distress that came with knowing she was similar to such an evil creature that made her not ever want to look at herself. Not only would she avoid any of the mirrors that she'd come across, but she'd also trained herself to avoid her reflection in the water. That's why she couldn't move any closer to the mirror in the room. She still wasn't at the point where she accepted herself enough to look at her reflection. While the anime does try to convey this with a series of flashbacks, it's something you wouldn't have picked up unless you were looking for it. I mean, it has been a part of Emilia that's been in front of our face the entire time. Like, one of the smaller clues was from the fact that Puck was always in charge of her appearance. It was one of the ways he'd been protecting her fragile heart from the wounds of her past. Given that this was the part of her that needed to change, Emilia made sure to open her eyes the moment she was about to hit the water. That way she'd finally have to face the reflection she'd always been hiding from. While she was a bit upset that she didn't look as much like Fortuna as she expected, nothing was going to hinder the feelings of happiness that came from this world of her dreams. So Emilia was able to end the trial understanding exactly who she was in the world she was in, leaving only one trial left for her to do. Anyway, that's pretty much all I've got for today. So be sure to leave a like and comment if you enjoyed the video. It really does help it to do better. Now, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week for episode 23. So, until then, ciao.